Thank you, John, for inviting me to give a talk in this technical deep dive. My name is Shlomo or Solly Angel, and I am a professor of city planning at the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. My talk today is titled Accommodating Urban Growth in the Global South, an Urban Planning Perspective. Urban population growth is now overwhelmingly concentrated in the Global South, where cities are expanding rapidly, both in population and area. I shall begin my presentation by examining demographic trends and spatial dynamics, emphasizing the limitations of containment and compact city paradigms in rapidly growing cities. I shall then present a strategic framework for accommodating this growth through a dual process of urban densification and expansion. Cities typically accommodate their growing populations by two complementary processes: the densification of their footprints and their expansion into the periphery. Densification and expansion are clearly observable in this picture. It shows Panama City, Panama in 1930 and in 2009. Densification and expansion are complementary. They are also substitutes for each other. Densification is usually greener than expansion, but it cannot substitute for expansion. Expansion will no doubt continue. What we can and should do is make it greener. I shall explore feasible and scalable approaches to densification based on the anatomy of density framework, including transit-oriented development, selective upzoning, and land readjustment. Simultaneously, I shall highlight the widespread reality of unplanned expansion characterized by irregular settlement patterns, limited access to jobs, and the occupation of areas of environmental risk. Drawing on numerous cases, I shall highlight the potential of simplified proactive planning for urban expansion, including arterial grid planning, the protection of no-build zones, and land readjustment to guide more inclusive, efficient, and resilient urban development. My aim today is to outline a policy framework tailored to the institutional, social, and economic realities of the Global South. I shall advocate for a pragmatic planning agenda that enables both markets and communities to accommodate growth at scale while aligning it with job growth, poverty alleviation, and climate resilience goals. Urban expansion and densification in the Global South are largely a function of urban population growth there. The Global South, shown in red here, includes all regions except North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. There are four key observations pertaining to the future of global urban population growth that urban planners working in the Global South may acknowledge and act upon. First, we must realize that urban population growth is not explosive, nor is it exponential. It is slowing down in every world region, including the fastest growing ones in the Global South, as shown here. Second, urban population growth has largely ended in the Global North and is now largely limited to the Global South. For every person added to cities in the Global North between 2025 and 2050, for example, 19 people will be added to cities in the Global South. Concerns for managing rapid urbanization are now largely diminished in the Global North, and other concerns, such as managing shrinking cities or net zero urban expansion to protect biodiversity, are taking their place. Managing urban expansion has now become largely the prerogative of the Global South, and in this endeavor, the latest urban planning concerns in the Global North will be of little help. Third, urban population growth in the coming decades will be unevenly distributed. 2/3 of the added urban population between 2025 and 2050, for example, is now projected to occur in two world regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, 37%, and South and Central Asia, 26%, as shown here. Other regions in the Global South are expected to each add a share amounting to 10% or less. Fourth, city populations in different world regions are growing at different rates. This slide shows the expected average growth rates during the 2025-2035 period of 654 cities that had 1 million people or more in 2025. Among the 100 cities that had 1 million people or more in 2025 that are projected to grow the fastest during the 2025-2035 period, 67 are in sub-Saharan Africa, 21 are in South and Central Asia, 9 are in the Middle East and North Africa, 2 are in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 1 is in Southeast Asia. There are none in Eastern Asia, in the Pacific, or in the global North. Given these 4 observations, it becomes clear that the greatest challenge for planning for urban expansion will be in sub-Saharan Africa, where cities are growing the fastest, while resources, both human and material, to manage that growth are limited. The next greatest challenge will be in the Indian subcontinent, where cities are growing at a slower rate and resources, both human and financial, are more plentiful. What also becomes clear, as I noted earlier, is that plans and policies to manage urban expansion in the global south will further diverge from plans and policies in the global north. My colleagues and I studied urban expansion using historical maps and recent satellite imagery in a representative group of 30 cities during the past 250 years. All these cities increased their urban footprints 16-fold or more during this period. Paris, France, for example, shown in this slide, had a population of 500,000 people in an area of 11 square kilometers in 1800. Its population grew 22-fold to 11 million by 2015, while its area grew 200-fold to 2,200 square kilometers during this period. More recent studies of global urban expansion using satellite imagery show that some cities are expanding faster than others. This is clearly illustrated here. Between 1992 and 2013, for example, Cairo, Egypt, increased its population by 64% and its urban footprint by 231%. Between 1989 and 2010, Bogota, Colombia, increased its population by 76%, while its urban footprint increased only by 24%. There is an interesting reason, by the way, why Bogota did not expand. During the Civil War in Colombia, people were in danger of being kidnapped when traveling in their cars to the suburbs. They preferred living in apartments in the city, which were much safer. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 11, Indicator 11.3.1, calls for slowing down the rate of urban land consumption so that it falls below the rate of urban population growth. This can be translated to mean that the goal is to increase average urban density over time. Since average density is the ratio of the city population and the area of its urban footprint, its decline means that the city's urban footprint increases at a faster rate than the city's population growth rate. For now, while some cities like Bogota can demonstrate a substantial increase in density, no region can boast a statistically significant increase in the average density of its cities over time, as shown here. This graph reports on the average density in 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020 in different world regions. Average densities did not change significantly at the 95% confidence level during the 1990-2020 period in Southeast Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, or in Latin America and the Caribbean. They did decline significantly in South and Central Asia, from 254 to 175 people per hectare, and in the global north, from 52 to 39 persons per hectare. And they declined precipitously in East Asia and the Pacific from 270 people per hectare in 1990 to 94 in 2020. In 2020, the average densities were the highest in South and Central Asia among world regions, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, and Southeast Asia. The lowest average densities were in the global north, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean, and East Asia and the Pacific. This graph reports on the share of cities in different world regions that more than doubled, more than tripled, or more than quadrupled the areas of their urban footprints during the 2000-2020 period. The East Asia and the Pacific region stands out as the region with the fastest expanding cities during this period. Other regions in the global south that share similar profiles with 6 to 10% of the cities, almost 400 cities altogether, more than tripled the areas of their urban footprints during this 20-year period. These cities require immediate attention and rapid intervention to manage their expansion. There are numerous studies that seek to explain the size of urban footprints, largely based on the classical urban economic models advanced in the 1960s, principally those of Alonso, Muth, and Mills. These urban economic models, like those of Birchfield and her colleagues in 2006, posit numerous hypotheses to explain variations in urban footprint areas. These urban footprints are expected to be larger in cities with larger populations, higher incomes, cheaper and faster urban transport, flat topographies, shallow groundwater tables, and a periphery not under intense cultivation. Variations in population and income account for more than 80% of the variation in urban expense in multiple regression models. These models suggest that there's very little room for policies aimed at limiting urban expansion, such as those involving greenbelts, urban growth boundaries, or construction moratoria, to make a difference in limiting urban expansion in the global south, especially in cities that are increasing rapidly in population. This is true even in cities with effective regulatory control of zoning and land use, as the two examples below show. And it is even truer in cities with ineffective regulatory control and high levels of informality. This map shows the abandoned Tokyo Greenbelt of 1941, which encompassed an area of 450 square kilometers. The urban extent of Tokyo in 2014 was 14 times larger, 6,400 plus square kilometers. This map shows the area within the 2003 Beijing Greenbelt that has been built upon by 2016. Much of the remaining area of the original Greenbelt has been fragmented, and much of it now stands as a barrier between the older city and its newer suburbs, rendering the city less compact than before and increasing the average travel distance in the city unnecessarily. Future attempts to contain urban expansion in cities in the global south that are still growing in population and income, well-meaning as they may be, are likely to fail. More specifically, simply trying to contain urban expansion without a comprehensive strategy for urban densification is likely to result in land supply bottlenecks, leading to housing affordability crises. This is what happened with the Seoul, Korea Greenbelt, for example, shown in this map. Moreover, urban expansion in the Seoul metropolitan region now takes place beyond the Greenbelt, resulting in longer commutes and increasing greenhouse gas emissions from transport. This raises an important question for urban planners, especially in the growing cities in the global south. Is there a green alternative to containment? There are good reasons to believe there is. Making cities more compact and greener as well does not call for strict containment, but rather for a proper balance between densification and expansion. This proper balance can be attained, in my view, through the regular operations of land and housing markets, if and only if pervasive organized resistance to both densification and expansion is overcome, the distortions created by inappropriate regulations and incentives are removed, and making room through both densification and expansion takes place on a level playing field. The pragmatic alternative to containment is a two-pronged approach to making room in cities: the densification of the existing footprints on the one hand and the greening of the urban expansion on the other. The anatomy of density framework, with which some of you may already be familiar, focuses on the various ways by which cities can densify and points to the various means that governments, both at the municipal and the national level, can enable and facilitate densification. What do I mean by the anatomy of density? In the time allotted to me here, I can only sketch it. Urban density is simply the ratio of the total population of a city and the total area it occupies. We measure urban density in, say, persons per hectare, where the hectare is 1% of a square kilometer. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, had an average of 372 persons per hectare in 2014. Minneapolis in the United States had an average of 10. Urban density in Dhaka was thus 37 times that of Minneapolis. But just knowing these facts does not tell us much. They hide more than they reveal. In what sense is Dhaka's density high? In what sense is Minneapolis's density low? The key insight I present to you here is in exposing the anatomy of density, in showing that urban density can be factored into separate metrics that expose its internal structure. What do we mean by factoring? We can factor the number 12, for example, into two factors, 3 and 4, then when multiplied together yield 12. 3 and 4 are factors of 12, so are 6 and 2. In a similar manner, we can factor urban density into 2, 3, 4, and then even 7 metrics. In doing so, we build a structure that incorporates and integrates most of the familiar density metrics used by urban planners. What we discovered, and I can report here, is that the factors that constitute urban density are all measurable as well. Independent research teams, unknown to us, used our methodology to measure them in Japanese cities and in Chilean cities, for example. The results in the first 10 cities we analyzed surprised us. The density of each of these 10 cities depended on quite different factors. We shall get into that soon. Let me start by showing what it means to break urban density into 3 factors. Factors that when multiplied together reconstitute urban density. This is shown in this graph. Floor space occupancy on the left is the ratio of the population of the city and its total residential floor area. It is a measure of how many people occupy a unit of residential floor area. The more there are, the less floor area per person. It is a gross measure of how crowded dwelling units in the city are. The floor area ratio, the yellow box, is a common density metric. It is defined here as the ratio of the total residential floor space in the city and the total residential area of the city, net of streets and other land uses. The residential share, the blue box on the right, is the share of the city's urban footprint occupied by residential areas. When we multiply these 3 factors together, total floor area and total area of residential building footprints cancel out, and we get urban density. This means that we can represent urban density as a product of 3 factors: floor space occupancy, floor area ratio, and residential share. When we represent urban density as a product of 3 factors, we can think about it as a box in 3-dimensional space, where floor space occupancy is its width, its x-axis, residential share is its length, its y-axis, and floor area ratio is its height, its z-axis. We obtained values for these 3 factors for 10 cities in different world regions: Dhaka, Hong Kong, Kinshasa, Bogota, Cairo, Baku, Madrid, Bangkok, Wuhan, and Minneapolis. The urban density boxes for these cities are shown here in gray in order of declining density from the top left to the bottom right. The colored cube on the top left represents the 10-city average value for each factor. We can now see that different cities get their urban density from quite different factors. Dhaka, the city with the highest density in the group, gets its density from above average floor space occupancy and residential share, while its floor area ratio is below average. Hong Kong, the second highest urban density, gets its density from its above average floor area ratio, even though it has low residential share. Kinshasa, the third highest urban density, gets its high density from its very high floor space occupancy. It is extremely overcrowded. And above average residential share, but its floor area ratio is way below average. This illustration makes it clear that every city has a unique combination of factors that give it its urban density. And we cannot guess the values of these factors from information about urban density alone. We need to look for them and measure them one by one. And the anatomy of density can go even further. We can factor urban density into 7 factors, as shown in this graph. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to discuss this in greater detail here. I urge you to look at the UN Habitat video titled The Anatomy of Density on YouTube for a more detailed exposition. The anatomy of density thus provides urban planners and policymakers with a tool that allows them both to implement complex densification plans and to measure how increases in each of the factors contribute to progress in densification, now a key goal in our global urban agenda. Let me end my talk about densification today with 7 lessons that I have learned from cities that have engaged in densification. The first lesson is natural verticalization can maintain the character of traditional neighborhoods, as in the case of Hanoi, Vietnam. In Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam, there's a tradition going back to the 19th century of building tube houses on long, narrow lots, starting with, say, 2 stories and then adding stories over the years, as shown in this picture. Some of the tube houses are now 12 stories tall and some house as many as 5 or 6 families. Neighborhoods with streets lined up with tube houses have a character that is not diminished or threatened by adding stories to individual houses. Why? I believe it is because all the plots share the same width. This is why taller buildings do not diminish shorter ones. There's an inherent equality among buildings there. In some sense, while celebrating variety, they all speak the same language. The second lesson is widespread densification through the upzoning of single-family homes to small multifamily apartments improves housing affordability, as in the case of Auckland, New Zealand. In 2016, the Auckland City Council upzoned approximately 3/4 of its residential area by abolishing single-family zoning. The upzoning has resulted in the addition of 20,000 new dwelling units to Auckland housing stock over a 5-year period. The share of dwelling units in single-family homes dropped from 70% to 50%, while the share of multi-unit housing increased to 50%, as this slide shows. The increase in the supply of dwellings in multi-unit structures has also improved affordability. The ratio of median rents to median incomes in Auckland fell from 22.7% in 2016 to 19.4% in 2023. In addition, Auckland's house prices have risen by 15% in comparison with 65% average increase in the rest of the country. The third lesson is randomly locate verticalization with single high-rise and bulky buildings can disrupt and destroy the character of traditional neighborhoods, as in the case of Vancouver, Canada. In suburban Vancouver, a single high-rise and bulky building, clearly speaking a different language, appears to disrupt and destroy the character of an established neighborhood. Here we see a building which is alien to the neighborhood. In this case, it is an 18-story building on 3 residential plots. The message it sends to the neighborhood is that its buildings are obsolete, soon to be demolished and replaced by towers. It increases what in recent literature has been termed their displaceability. Here's a similar example, this one from San Francisco, California. The idea behind the 2 schemes is the same. They do not come to repair the neighborhood, to embellish it, or to celebrate it. Instead, they threaten it. There are good reasons for neighbors to organize to resist this type of densification because it diminishes and belittles them. And it need not mean that they are against densification in principle. They may be more welcoming to verticalization of their own homes, adding 1 or more stories while keeping the character of their neighborhood intact. They may be more willing to entertain larger and taller structures in their neighborhood if they were located on single plots and if their height did not vary by more than a few stories from the rest of the buildings in the neighborhood. The fourth lesson, densification through urban renewal often results in gentrification and in the displacement of lower income families, as in the case of Boston's West End neighborhood. This case was documented by Herbert Gans in 1962. Gans recorded the loss of social capital resulting from the dissolution of stable communities because of the mass displacement, mostly of low-income families, in the name of slum clearance and urban renewal. Gans showed that the West End neighborhood was not a slum, but a vibrant and vital urban neighborhood providing affordable housing to low and low middle income families. Still, many governments the world over have used slum clearance repeatedly as justification for the displacement of low-income families, the destruction of their affordable homes, and its replacement by unaffordable housing. The fifth lesson, verticalization can result in the decline of neighborhood density and in the decline of affordability, as in the case of China's urban villages. Cities in China are typically surrounded by villages, and as they expand, these villages are integrated into the cities. But while their agricultural lands are acquired by municipalities, who then develop them and auction them, the residential areas of villages remain under the jurisdiction of their rural communes. Village residential areas were typically pooled and subdivided into plots with 100% plot coverage separated by narrow roads, as this slide shows. Plots were then developed into walk-up single-room occupancy structures that offered affordable rental accommodations to migrants who came to work in the city, while offering alternative incomes to commune members who lost their fields. These urban villages, like the one in Guangzhou shown here, were of a very high density because of their high plot coverage, because of the small size of their single-room apartments, typically of the order of 16 square meters, and because of their height, typically 6 to 8 stories. The proliferation of these urban villages allowed China to urbanize rapidly without the formation of slums or shantytowns, an unparalleled accomplishment, and without requiring either the government or the private sector to invest massively in housing. Urban villages are now often demolished to make way for towers in the park, symbols of progress and prosperity, celebrating light, air, and wide green spaces, following in the footsteps of Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin of 1925, shown in this picture. Here's a typical example of towers in the park in China. By my back-of-the-envelope calculations, assuming an apartment size of 120 square meters, 25% plot coverage, and 50-story buildings, their density would be less than one-third the density of an urban village. Which leads us to an important lesson, a lesson that many of you already know. Verticalization does not necessarily mean densification. The sixth lesson is densification can take place without displacing the original residents, as in the case of the Tama 38 outline plan in Israel. Tama 38 has succeeded in converting homeowners from a NIMBY, not in my backyard attitude, to a YIMBY, yes in my backyard one. Small condominium buildings, typically with 12 to 16 apartments, are densified and verticalized by an agreement with a contractor developer to improve the building in exchange for adding 2 or more stories to the building, which they can then sell. The program was off to a slow start, but caught on more rapidly when homeowners only had to secure a 2/3 majority to approve the project, and when government agreed to forego the capital gains tax on the increased value of their apartments. It is estimated that urban regeneration under Tama 38, which largely involves single buildings, and its sister Pinui Binui, demolish and rebuild, which involves several adjacent buildings, now provides 1/3 of the new apartments in the country. Admittedly, this plan focuses only on homeowners and ignores the predicament of renters who are usually displaced without compensation. The seventh and final lesson is properly zoned verticalization along transportation arteries and transit hubs can maintain the character of traditional neighborhoods, as in the case of Curitiba, Brazil. The greatest potential for densification and verticalization is in city centers and subcenters, transit hubs, and areas along transit lines, commonly known as transit-oriented development, or TOD. Urban locations along transit lines or within a short walking distance from transit lines are natural places to allow for higher densities. They have premier accessibility, and the land value there merits high-rise construction. An excellent case where this has been accomplished is Curitiba, Brazil, one of the first cities to adopt a bus rapid transit system along 5 of its major thoroughfares. There are now high-rise, high-density buildings along both sides of these thoroughfares, while neighborhoods extending behind them have been spared unwanted densification and verticalization. These 7 lessons begin to suggest a set of guidelines for the planned densification of cities as shown here. The first guideline is that densification should not be allowed to destroy the character of neighborhoods. The second guideline is that densification must involve sitting residents and must not make their living conditions worse than before. The third guideline is that whenever possible, expropriation of lands for private development should be avoided, opting instead for land pooling and readjustment where developers negotiate with landowners and obtain the land when a supermajority agrees to the deal they offered. The fourth guideline is the emphasis on transit-oriented development, TOD, permitting the demolition of existing structures along main arterial roads in cities and replacing them with high-density, high-rise, mixed-use building. The fifth guideline is downtown redevelopment, permitting the demolition of existing structures in the downtown areas of cities and replacing them with high-density, high-rise, mixed-use buildings. The sixth guideline is that densification can be project-based, adding stories and renovating apartment buildings in designated project areas, or demolishing them and replacing them with high-density, high-rise, mixed-use buildings. Finally, the seventh guideline calls for the organic densification of traditional residential neighborhoods, permitting the construction of accessory dwelling units in traditional housing areas, as well as the subdivision of larger houses into smaller ones. This brings my discussion of densification to an end. I will now turn my attention to its complement in accommodating urban growth, green urban expansion. Many cities in the global south are growing rapidly and expanding into their periphery in a largely unplanned manner. There are 4 serious problems with unplanned urban expansion. First, it results in informal or irregular settlements that are not laid out into streets, plots, and public open spaces before they are occupied, making it difficult to introduce these services later. Second, there's a dearth of arterial roads that can connect the new urban peripheries to the urban job market and to urban services, reducing the overall productivity of the city. Third, unplanned urban expansion often takes place in areas of high climate change risk and without regard to the preservation of environmental assets. And fourth, inappropriate, unrealistic, and market-blind laws and regulations render much of the new development informal or illegal, while making urban planning largely irrelevant to what is happening on the ground. This Google Earth image shows irregular settlement development on the periphery of Kolkata, India, where rural plots are simply cut up and sold as residential plots, leaving virtually no land for streets or public open spaces. The absence of proper layouts of plots and streets in informal settlements makes it considerably more difficult to provide residents with proper services, including streets, water, sewerage, storm drainage, electricity, public open spaces, ambulance access, and fire protection. Abiko and his colleagues have shown that providing infrastructure services in saturated informal settlements, like the favelas in Brazil, for example, costs 3 to 6 times more than providing them before home building takes place. The absence of proper plot boundaries in irregular settlements also accentuates land disputes, and the absence of proper ownership documentation makes tenure insecure, increasing the fear of eviction, and hence limiting investments in both houses and community amenities. This slide shows the absence of arterial roads that typically carry public transport in a 60 square kilometer area northeast Bangkok, Thailand. The absence of arterial roads that can help move people, especially on public transport, compromises the access of more distant locations to the urban job market, making the city less productive. Business as usual urban expansion does not respect areas of climate risk and environmental assets that need to remain free of development, nor does it provide an adequate hierarchy of public open spaces. This is particularly acute when informal settlements are built on natural drainage channels and riverbanks, increasing the risk and damage from flooding. The same is true for building on steep slopes or for building in wetland areas. More generally, business as usual urban expansion creates large areas on the periphery of cities that are ill adapted to climate change. Finally, regulations governing zoning and land use, land subdivision, and building construction are often oblivious to the availability of resources, both human and financial, for abiding by the rules. They are also oblivious to the gradual process in which cities are built when such resources are limited. The insistence on unrealistic regulations and the refusal of government authorities to engage in constructive ways with the actual settlement formation on the urban periphery of cities renders urban planning largely irrelevant, unable to guide urban expansion, unable to provide infrastructure at scale, and unable to enable affordable housing to be created at scale. How can those challenges be effectively addressed? How can urban planning make itself relevant? How can we reorient urban planning to effectively guide green, productive, and inclusive urban expansion in the rapidly growing cities in the global south? The answers to these questions are the focus of the last part of my talk today. I shall elaborate on a set of 7 guidelines for green, productive, and inclusive planning for urban expansion. In brief, all these guidelines can be summarized in one phrase: arterial roads, no-build zones, and land subdivisions. If you just keep this one phrase in mind, arterial roads, no-build zones, and land subdivisions, you already have a basic understanding of what I am talking about. The other half is just detail. Important detail, but just detail. The first guideline is that planning for urban expansion must be based on realistic projections of both populations and densities for the next 25 to 30 years. These projections should be used to estimate the amount of land that would be needed to convert to urban use during this period. There are now, for the first time, global data sources for both population and built-up areas for all human settlements. There are at least 3 global population grids with a 100-meter resolution. There are at least 2 global built-up area grids as well that can be used to map the footprints of cities. Both provide historical data going back at least to the year 2000 that can be used to track historical urban expansion. There is also a comprehensive data set with census data for several periods for all cities at citypopulation.de, albeit without identifying their physical extent. And finally, there's the UN Population Division's World Urbanization Prospects with urban population for all countries from 1950 to 2050. All these global data sets still have serious issues and will need to be sorted out, but they are improving all the time. These data sets already provide adequate information for projecting both populations and average urban densities into the future, making it possible to calculate the amount of land needed for urban expansion for every city in the coming decades. Going forward, together with partners from the World Resources Institute's WRI and the World Bank's Research Department, we're now working to create the Atlas of Urban Growth. The Atlas would provide easy access to freely available online maps and metrics of historical urban expansion, topography, environmental hazards, and environmental assets for all cities that now have 50,000 people or more. The main function of the Atlas is to make these data, already available but rather difficult to use, globally accessible to municipal officials in cities everywhere so that they can make their own urban expansion plans. The second guideline advocates for erring on the side of projecting more rather than less land for urban expansion. Why? Because projecting too little land will result in costly unplanned expansion, while preparing too much land will cost little if preparations are minimal. The plan for Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, is a good example of a plan that did not allow for realistic urban expansion. Lucio Costa, the urban planner who designed the new city in 1957, insisted that the plan be limited to 500,000. His design, known as the Plano Piloto, was surrounded by a greenbelt. Construction beyond the planned edge of the city started in 1958 while the city was being built, as workers, for which no housing was planned, began to construct irregular settlements to house their families. The city has since expanded in a largely unplanned manner in all directions. The population of the Brasilia metropolitan area in 2025 was close to 5 million, 10 times the planned population of the city in 1957. In contrast, Ildefons Cerdà's 1858 expansion plan for Barcelona expanded the built-up area of the city tenfold, as this slide shows. The third guideline calls for preparing a top-down plan for the entire projected expansion area that identifies the land projected to be converted to urban use in the next 25-30 years. This plan need not determine specific land uses everywhere, but it should clearly identify all no-build zones, distinguishing them from lands to be converted to urban use. Drainage channels, steep slopes, low-lying areas subject to sea level rise, and important environmental assets are no-build zones that need to be clearly identified, demarcated, and protected from development. It is important to realize at the outset that simply mapping no-build zones on maps that decorate the walls of municipal offices is not enough. Here's one example: the 1999 zoning map for San Salvador. By 2001, the new built-up areas in the planned zones designated maximum protection and unsafe to build was more than twice the new built-up area in the zones designated urban area. The fourth guideline calls for top-down planning for an arterial road grid throughout the projected expansion area and the marking of the rights-of-way on the ground with beacons and, if possible, planting trees along its future sidewalks to announce it and protect it. The arterial road grid would consist of 30-meter wide roads spaced 1 kilometer apart that can carry public transport, that are walking distance from home and workplaces, and that connect workers to jobs. Milton Keynes, United Kingdom, is a recent example of an arterial road grid that carries public transport as shown in this map. Milton Keynes is a second-generation British new town constructed in the late 1960s, some 80 kilometers north of London. It was designed for 250,000 people, and its population as of the 2021 census was 264,000. The city was designed with an arterial road grid with wide roads spaced 1 kilometer apart. The roads were designed to keep through traffic away from neighborhoods. All roads carry public transports so that every location in the city can be reached from every other location by public transport within walking distance of homes and businesses. Such connectivity integrated the city's economy and made it more productive and more resilient to economic shocks, as all workplaces are accessible from all homes. Local officials in Mekelle, Ethiopia, participated in an NYU workshop in 2013 where they prepared a draft arterial road plan for their city. They later finalized the plan and implemented large parts of it. This is an area in the southwest periphery of Mekelle showing the development of the macro blocks within its arterial road grid in 2024. In Valledupar, Colombia, parts of the future arterial road grid shown here were marked with trees along their future sidewalks. The fifth guideline calls for creating a regulatory framework and providing technical as well as financial support for rural landowners and their traditional leaders on the urban periphery to create bottom-up plans that pool and subdivide their lands before disposing of them. One of the best examples of laying out an area before occupying it is the Comas neighborhood in Lima, Peru, shown in this slide. Comas was a squatter invasion on public land on the periphery of Lima in the 1960s. Before the invasion, the area was laid out with 10-meter wide roads and 10 by 20-meter plots with areas reserved for public open spaces, schools, and markets. The area developed into a desirable urban neighborhood, and houses now there cost as much as $180,000. Bottom-up land pooling and subdivision has been practiced in many countries: Germany, Japan, Australia, and Korea, to name a few, and lately in Ahmedabad, India, where it is widely practiced, as this slide shows. Bottom-up neighborhood plans created through land pooling and subdivision in advance of occupation can ensure that adequate lands are left for arterial roads, streets, and public open spaces without the need for expropriation and compensation. Subdividing land with properly registered residential plots and possibly with a promise of the future provision of infrastructure services as well, can be a viable alternative to the formation of irregular settlements when it is done at scale. It can also produce affordable housing at scale, with public authorities playing a facilitating and enabling role rather than seeking to provide public housing directly. The sixth guideline calls for the empowerment of municipalities with their limited human resources to make and implement their own expansion plans instead of having such plans prepared by outsiders and left for them to implement. That guideline calls for plans to be simple. It also calls for increasing the technical and managerial capacity of municipal officials to prepare and implement their expansion plans, providing maps and data as well as training and supervision, while leaving municipal officials in charge. The mayor of Gabile, Somaliland, at the completion of a 2022 workshop on urban expansion planning, had this to say: "Now, we not only have a long-term urban expansion plan for our city, but we also know how to do it by ourselves, and this is exactly what we need." We at New York University have been dedicated to making this empowerment model work since 2012, working with local officials in Colombia, Ethiopia, and Malawi, for example, who have made plans for the orderly expansion of their cities. The picture shown here is of municipal officials from Bahir Dar, Ethiopia, drafting a long-term plan for the expansion of the city at a 2013 workshop organized by NYU in Addis Ababa. To assist officials like those of Bahir Dar in planning for accommodating growth, both by densification and by expansion, we have designed an online course in partnership with Urban Shift. The course, titled Accommodating Urban Growth, is now freely available online in 6 languages. The Director of Planning and Development for Blantyre, Malawi, who took the online course, commented, "I went through it twice. I found everything to be very relevant." To conclude, empowerment has to do with what we call in architecture, who is holding the pencil? Who should be making and thus owning the plan? The foreign consultant, armed with the latest globalized knowledge, or local officials who understand the situation on the ground and, provided with simple tools they can master, can make and own the plans they really need? Finally, the 7th guideline identifies the role of central government and bilateral and multilateral organizations that provided with development assistance as an enabling role that allows municipalities and local communities to organize, plan, and implement urban expansion at scale from the ground up. To quote van der Linden in 1994, "If the government is to intervene at all, its interventions should resemble the informal solutions much more closely. What is needed, in brief, is the bridging of the gap between the legal and the illegal systems." End quote. From the perspective of housing policy, for example, government support for the creation of large numbers of registered residential plots where people could build their homes over time and where government could gradually improve infrastructure services is an appropriate way for governments in the Global South to become proactive in new housing production at scale. This guideline proposes a modification in the process by which informal housing is currently being produced in many countries in the region, encouraging and supporting the provision of properly registered residential plots with minimal or no services by rural landholders under the leadership of traditional authorities on which people can gradually build homes. Support can take the form of creating and enforcing regulations that allow this to happen from the bottom up, facilitating plot registration, and providing incentives such as the promise of early provision of infrastructure services like water, sewerage, drainage, and electricity in properly subdivided neighborhoods. The resulting settlements are still informal, both in the sense that they would still lack a full complement of infrastructure services and in the sense that houses would not be completed before they are occupied. Still, this modification in the sequence by which informal housing typically occurs creates conditions for neighborhoods developed in this way to flourish and mature into regular urban neighborhoods like the Comas neighborhood in Lima described earlier. This sequence is to be distinguished from the sites and service initiatives sponsored by the World Bank in the 1970s, in the 1980s, like the one in Senegal shown in this slide. The key difference is that sites and services projects were undertaken as a form of public housing projects, typically planned, implemented, and managed by national housing authorities on land purchased or owned by the government. In contrast, in the intervention proposed here, the landholders themselves, under the leadership of traditional or village authorities, plan and implement the projects. World Bank assistance, if made available, could take the form of Program for Results, or P4R. Municipalities that would provide a set of approved plans showing areas where landholders pooled and subdivided their land in accordance with agreed upon municipal directives would receive funds for technical assistance, surveying and title registration, and infrastructure services for these subdivisions. The promise of funding would act as strong incentives for landholders on the urban fringe to come together to pool and subdivide their lands instead of disposing of them for irregular settlement formation. To conclude my talk, the expansion of cities into their peripheries must not be resisted. It must be planned. We can all agree on that. We can also agree that for one reason or another, most land use plans end up as paper exercises. Effective, simple plans that can show results on the ground must be of two kinds. First, simple top-down plans that identify the lands to be converted to urban use, identify no-build zones, and clearly mark an arterial road grid throughout the expansion area before it is occupied. Second, simple bottom-up neighborhood plans where local landowners are organized to pool and subdivide their lands with adequate areas reserved for streets and public open spaces instead of disposing them bit by bit to form irregular informal settlements. In short, minimal territorial planning for urban expansion requires arterial roads, no-build zones, and land subdivisions. And this simple conclusion brings my talk to an end. Thank you.